The brass telegraph handle trembled beneath Captain Arthur Rostron's grip as the impossible message crackled through the wireless room of the RMS Carpathia. CQD, CQD. SOS, SOS. Come at once. We have struck a berg. It's a CQD, old man. Position 41.46 N, 49.57 W. The words hung in the frigid April air like a death sentence. The unsinkable Titanic, pride of the White Star Line, was dying in the black waters of the North Atlantic, and 200 souls hung in the balance between life and the abyss. Rostron's fingers traced his navigation chart, calculating distances with practiced precision. 58 miles. 58 miles of ice-choked waters and darkness so complete, it seemed to swallow hope itself. His ship, the modest Carpathia, was no racing vessel. She was built for comfort, not the desperate sprint that now called to her across the waves. The captain's cabin fell silent except for the steady thrum of engines below. Rostron closed his eyes, feeling the weight of command settle upon his shoulders. In his mind's eye, he could see them. Passengers aboard the Titanic, perhaps already standing on slanting decks, perhaps already lowering lifeboats into the merciless Atlantic. Children clutching their mothers' hands. Men helping women into boats they themselves would never enter. All of them looking toward the horizon for salvation that might never come. Harold Cottam appeared in the doorway, his young face pale. "Captain," he whispered, "they're calling for immediate assistance. The Titanic she's going down by the head." Rostron turned from the chart table, his steel-grey eyes reflecting the amber glow of the cabin's oil lamp. The decision that would define his life crystallized in that moment, like ice forming on a winter pond. He could maintain course, arrive safely with his own passengers secure. He could sight the dangers. The ice field that had already claimed the mighty Titanic, the risk to his own vessel, and the 743 souls aboard her. He could choose the safe path, but Arthur Rostron was not a man built for the safe path. "Mr. Dean." He called to his first officer, his voice carrying the authority of decades at sea. "Sound the general alarm. All hands on deck. We're changing course for the Titanic's position." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the chart one final time. "And Mr. Dean, tell the engine room to give me everything she's got. We're going to push the Carpathia harder than she's ever been pushed before." The first officer's eyes widened. "Sir, the ice field." "I know about the ice field, Mr. Dean." Rostron's voice carried absolute conviction. "I also know that there are people dying in the water tonight. And we may be their only hope. Prepare the ship for rescue operations. We're going into that ice field, and we're bringing every soul we can find back with us." As the Carpathia's engines roared to life with renewed vigor, her bow cutting through the dark waters with desperate purpose, Captain Rostron stood alone on the bridge. The night stretched before them like an endless void, punctuated only by the ghostly silhouettes of icebergs that caught the starlight, and threw it back in cold, crystalline fragments. The wireless crackled again, fainter now, the signal growing weaker as the Titanic's power failed. "Come as quickly as possible, old man. The engine room is filling up." Rostron's jaw tightened, his knuckles white against the ship's wheel. Time was slipping away like sand through an hourglass, each minute that passed another step closer to tragedy. In the depths of the ship, stokers fed coal into the furnaces with desperate efficiency, their faces blackened with soot despite the frigid air. Chief Engineer Johnston moved among them like a conductor directing a symphony of salvation, his voice rising above the roar of machinery. "More steam, lads. Every pound you can give her." Johnston's words echoed off the steel bulkheads. "There are people in the water tonight, and we're their lifeline." The Carpathia shuddered as her engines exceeded their designed capacity, her hull cutting through the swells with violence that spoke of desperate urgency. In the passenger cabins, bewildered travelers awakened to running feet and shouted orders, their comfortable journey transformed into something far more significant. They did not yet understand that they had become witnesses to an act of heroism that would echo through the ages. On the bridge, Rostron consulted his chronometer, with the precision of a man for whom every second carried the weight of human life. The Carpathia was making unprecedented speed, nearly 18 knots, faster than she had ever traveled. But was it fast enough? The question haunted him, as he stared into the darkness ahead. The lookouts in the crow's nest strained their eyes against the night. watching for the telltale gleam of ice that could send the Carpathia to join the Titanic on the ocean floor. The irony was not lost on any of them. In their desperate rush to save lives, they risked creating an even greater tragedy. Ice ahead, 2 points off the starboard bow. The cry from the lookout cut through the night air like a blade, and Rostron's hands moved instinctively to adjust their course. The first of many icebergs loomed out of the darkness, a mountain of frozen death that caught the starlight like a malevolent eye. The captain's breathing remained steady, his movements precise as he navigated between the floating monuments to nature's power. This was only the beginning. Ahead lay a field of ice that stretched for miles, a maze of frozen obstacles that had already claimed the greatest ship of the age. But the Carpathia pressed on, her captain's determination driving her forward through waters that had become a graveyard for human ambition. The wireless fell silent. In the suffocating silence that followed the Titanic's final transmission, Captain Rostron felt the weight of the ocean pressing against his chest. The absence of that familiar crackling voice seemed to echo through the Carpathia's corridors, a void that spoke of tragedy beyond comprehension. Harold Cottam sat hunched over his equipment, his fingers dancing across the keys in desperate attempts to re-establish contact, but the ether remained stubbornly quiet. "Captain?" Cottam's voice cracked as he turned from his apparatus. "I've lost them, sir. The Titanic. She's gone quiet." Gone quiet. The words carried implications too vast to fully comprehend. The greatest ship ever built, with her thousands of souls, reduced to silence in the span of hours. But silence did not necessarily mean death, Rostron reminded himself. It could mean the wireless equipment had failed, that the operators had abandoned their posts to help with evacuation, that the ship's power had finally succumbed to rising water. "Maintain course, Mr. Cottam," Rostron said, his voice carrying across the bridge with unwavering authority. "Keep trying to raise them, and send word to any other vessels in the area. Tell them we're proceeding to the Titanic's last known position." The Carpathia continued her desperate race through the icefield, her engines straining against their mechanical limits as she wove between towering bergs that rose from the black water, like the spires of some frozen cathedral. Each iceberg they passed seemed more menacing, more capable of the destruction that had already claimed their quarry. Rostron found himself calculating angles and distances with mathematical precision, plotting a course that would bring them to the disaster site without adding to the night's toll of tragedy. In the passenger quarters below, word of their mission had begun to spread through the ship like ripples across a pond. Dr. Frank McGee, the ship's physician, had already begun converting the dining saloons into makeshift hospitals, his medical supplies arranged with military precision across tables that hours before had hosted elegant dinners. Passengers emerged from their cabins in various states of dress, some still in evening wear, others wrapped in hastily donned robes. Mrs. Lewis Ogden, a first-class passenger, appeared in the main saloon carrying an armload of blankets stripped from her own bed. Her usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, her graying hair escaping from its pins, but her eyes burned with determination that transformed her from pampered socialite into something far more substantial. "Doctor," she called to McGee, "I've brought what I could from my cabin." "What else do you need?" "Hot coffee, Mrs. Ogden," the doctor replied without looking up from his preparations, "as much as the galley can produce, and soup, anything warm. If there are survivors in the water, hypothermia will be our greatest enemy." He paused, his hands stilling over surgical instruments. "And prayers, madam. We're going to need all the prayers we can get." Throughout the ship, a transformation was taking place that would have seemed impossible just hours before. Passengers who had never spoken beyond polite nods now worked side by side, their class distinctions dissolved in the face of human need. The Carpathia's crew, already pushed to their limits, found themselves supported by willing hands as their passengers threw themselves into preparations with enthusiasm that bordered on desperation. In the engine room, Chief Engineer Johnston wiped sweat from his brow, his eyes never leaving the pressure gauges that told the story of their mechanical salvation. The Carpathia's engines were performing beyond their specifications, driven by men who understood that failure was not an option. "She's giving us everything she's got, Chief," called out Second Engineer Morrison, his voice barely audible above the machinery's roar. "But I don't know how much longer we can maintain this pace. The bearings are running hot, and the pressure's higher than I've ever seen it." Johnston nodded grimly, his experienced eye reading the signs of mechanical stress written in the vibration of deck plates beneath his feet, and the pitch of the engine's song. The Carpathia was a good ship, built with solid Clyde craftsmanship, but she was being asked to perform miracles tonight. "Keep her running, Morrison," he replied, his voice carrying absolute command. "Whatever it takes, keep her running. There are people dying out there, and we're their only hope." On the bridge, Rostron consulted his chronometer once again. 3 hours and 30 minutes since the first distress call. 3 hours and 30 minutes of desperate speed through treacherous waters, of mechanical strain and human determination, of hope battling against the inexorable mathematics of disaster. The Titanic's last reported position lay just ahead, somewhere in the darkness that seemed to swallow their searchlights like a hungry beast. "Lookouts report debris in the water, Captain," called First Officer Dean, his binoculars trained on the black expanse ahead. "And, sir, I think I see lifeboats." Rostron's heart leaped in his chest, a surge of hope so powerful it nearly brought tears to his eyes. Lifeboats meant survivors. Lifeboats meant their desperate race had not been in vain, that somewhere in the darkness ahead, human beings clung to life, and waited for salvation. He raised his own binoculars, scanning the water with the intensity of a man whose entire world had narrowed to this single moment. There, a flash of white against the black water, the unmistakable shape of a lifeboat riding low in the swells, and another, farther off, barely visible in the pre-dawn gloom. His trained eye began to count them, his heart sinking as he realized how few there were, compared to the number that should have been launched from a ship the size of the Titanic. But each boat represented lives saved, hope fulfilled, the triumph of human courage over the indifferent sea. "Reduce speed, Mr. Dean," Rostron ordered, his voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "Signal the engine room. Dead slow ahead. We don't want to swamp any boats with our wake." He paused, his eyes never leaving the scene of devastation beginning to reveal itself in the growing light. "And Mr. Dean, prepare to receive survivors. All hands to rescue stations." The Carpathia's engines fell to a whisper as she approached the scene of disaster, her momentum carrying her forward through water littered with the debris of human ambition. Deck chairs floated alongside life preservers, their incongruous presence a testament to the speed with which disaster had overtaken the mighty Titanic. The smell of the sea was different here, tinged with oil and smoke and something else, the indefinable scent of tragedy that seemed to hang in the air like a shroud. As the first lifeboat drew alongside the Carpathia's hull, Rostron could see the faces of the survivors. Pale, exhausted, marked by exposure and shock, but alive. Gloriously, miraculously alive. Women clutched children to their breasts, their eyes wide with trauma. Men sat hunched over oars they no longer had strength to pull, their formal evening wear sodden and torn. But they were breathing, their hearts still beating, their lives snatched from the jaws of the abyss. The rescue began with methodical precision. Each survivor lifted aboard with care that bordered on reverence. Rope ladders were lowered, cargo nets rigged, and willing hands reached down to pull the living from their floating tombs. Dr. McGee moved among them like an angel of mercy, his medical training guiding him to those most in need, while volunteers wrapped survivors in blankets and pressed cups of hot coffee into trembling hands. Mrs. Ogden found herself cradling a small child whose mother had collapsed from exhaustion, the little girl's eyes wide with confusion and terror as she searched faces around her for something familiar. "Mama?" the child whispered, her voice barely audible above the sounds of rescue. "Where's Mama?" "She's safe, darling," Mrs. Ogden murmured, though she had no way of knowing if the words were true. "You're safe now. We're going to take care of you." As boat after boat was emptied of its human cargo, the full scope of disaster began to reveal itself. The survivors spoke in whispers of the great ship's final moments, how she had broken apart in the middle, her lights flickering and dying as she slipped beneath the waves. They told of the band that had played until the very end, of men who had stepped back from lifeboats to ensure women and children could escape. But most of all, they spoke of the cold, the terrible, bone-deep cold of the North Atlantic that had claimed so many who had made it off the ship alive. The water temperature had been just below freezing, and those who had found themselves in the sea had minutes, not hours, before hypothermia claimed them. The lifeboats had been filled with the sounds of the dying, voices calling out in the darkness growing weaker and more distant until they faded into the silence of death. But would there be more survivors out there, clinging to debris, waiting in the growing dawn light? The question haunted every face on the Carpathia's deck as they scanned the horizon, hoping against hope that their rescue mission was not yet complete. Captain Rostron stood at the rail of his ship, watching as the last of the lifeboats was brought alongside, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what they had not been able to save. 705 souls had been pulled from the sea, lives that would continue because of the Carpathia's desperate race through the night, but more than 1,500 others had perished, their bodies claimed by the depths, or floating somewhere in the vast expanse of the Atlantic, beyond the reach of rescue or recovery. The sun was beginning to rise now, painting the eastern horizon with shades of gold and crimson that seemed almost obscene in their beauty after the night's tragedy. The ice field that had claimed the Titanic stretched as far as the eye could see, a wilderness of frozen monuments to the power of nature and the fragility of human ambition. Somewhere beneath those waters lay the broken hull of the greatest ship ever built, her grand staircase and elegant dining rooms now home to fish and darkness. As the Carpathia turned away from the scene of disaster, her decks crowded with survivors and her crew exhausted from their night of heroism, Rostron felt the weight of command settling upon his shoulders once again. They had done what they could, pushed themselves and their ship beyond all reasonable limits, in service of strangers who had needed them desperately. But the questions would come later. Why had they been the only ship to respond with such urgency? Why had others, closer to the disaster, failed to arrive in time? For now, though, there was only the immediate need to care for those they had saved, to provide comfort and medical attention to people who had looked death in the face and lived to tell the tale. The Carpathia's passengers had opened their hearts and cabins to the survivors, sharing clothes and food, and the simple human warmth that meant more than any material comfort. In the face of tragedy, the artificial barriers that divided people had crumbled, revealing the fundamental truth that bound all humanity together, the recognition that every life had value. Among the survivors was Margaret Brown, whose forceful personality and determination to help others had already earned her the nickname, the unsinkable Molly Brown, among her fellow passengers. She moved through the ship like a force of nature, organizing relief efforts and comforting those who had lost everything, her own trauma subsumed in her need to help others cope with theirs. In the ship's makeshift hospital, Dr. McGee worked tirelessly to treat cases of exposure and shock, his medical supplies stretched thin by the sheer number of patients requiring attention. Some of the survivors would recover quickly, their youth and constitution allowing them to bounce back from their ordeal with remarkable resilience. Others would carry the physical and emotional scars of that night for the rest of their lives, their dreams forever haunted by the sound of the great ship breaking apart. Among the most severely affected was Eleanor Widener, whose husband Harry had perished when the Titanic went down. She sat in the ship's library, staring out at the approaching harbor with eyes that seemed to see nothing, her hands clutching a small leather-bound book that had been her husband's final gift to her. The book was a first edition of Francis Bacon's essays, purchased during their honeymoon in Paris, and it represented all that remained of a life cut short by the indifferent sea. "Mrs. Widener," said Mrs. Brown, settling into the chair beside her with gentle authority that had made her such a comfort to her fellow survivors. "We'll be docking soon. Is there anyone you'd like me to contact for you?" Eleanor turned slowly, her gaze focusing with difficulty on the older woman's concerned face. "My son," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of the ship's engines. "George is at Harvard. He'll need to know about his father." She paused, her fingers tightening on the book. "How do I tell him that Harry died because he insisted I get into the lifeboat first? How do I explain that his father's last words were about taking care of me?" Mrs. Brown reached out and covered Eleanor's hands with her own, feeling the tremor that ran through the younger woman's frame like an electric current. "You tell him that his father was a hero," she said firmly. "You tell him that Harry Widener died as he lived, putting the people he loved before his own safety. That's a legacy any son would be proud to inherit." Throughout the ship, similar conversations were taking place as survivors struggled to come to terms with what they had experienced and what it would mean for their futures. Some spoke of never setting foot on a ship again, their faith in the safety of ocean travel shattered by the night's events. Others talked of the need to honor those who had died by living their own lives more fully, more purposefully, carrying forward the memory of those who had been lost. The wireless room crackled back to life as other ships finally began to respond to the disaster, their messages filling the air with offers of assistance that came too late to matter. The Olympic, Titanic sister ship, was racing toward them but would not arrive for hours. The Californian, which had been tantalizingly close to the disaster site, had finally awakened to the magnitude of what had occurred, and was steaming toward them with what seemed like deliberate slowness. But the Carpathia had been there when it mattered, her captain's decision to risk everything for strangers proving to be the difference between life and death for hundreds of souls. As she steamed toward New York with her precious cargo of survivors, she carried with her a story that would be told and retold for generations, a tale of heroism in the face of disaster, of human compassion triumphing over the indifferent forces of nature, of a modest ship, and her extraordinary captain who had answered the call when it came. As the day wore on and the Carpathia drew closer to New York, the full magnitude of what had occurred began to sink in for both survivors and rescuers alike. The Titanic had been more than just a ship, she had been a symbol of human achievement, a testament to the belief that technology and engineering could overcome any obstacle that nature might place in their path. Her loss represented not just the death of 1,500 people, but the shattering of an illusion that had sustained an entire generation. But from that tragedy had emerged something else, a story of heroism and sacrifice that would inspire people for generations to come. The tale of Captain Rostron and the Carpathia would be told in books and films, in speeches and sermons, as an example of what human beings could accomplish when they put the needs of others before their own safety and comfort. Captain Rostron remained on the bridge as his ship approached New York Harbor, his eyes scanning the horizon for the familiar landmarks that would guide them home. Behind him lay the scene of the greatest maritime disaster in history, a field of ice and debris that would soon be empty of all traces of the tragedy that had occurred there. Ahead lay the responsibility of delivering his precious cargo of survivors to safety, of facing the questions and investigations that would surely follow. The harbor bells of New York rang out across the water like a hymn of homecoming as the Carpathia approached her berth at Pier 54, her decks lined with survivors whose hollow eyes reflected both the trauma of loss and the miracle of salvation. 3 days had passed since that terrible night in the North Atlantic, 3 days during which the world had held its breath, waiting for news of the greatest maritime disaster in human memory. The docking process was handled with the same precision and care that had marked the entire rescue operation. Each survivor helped ashore with a gentleness that spoke of the profound respect that had developed between rescuers and rescued during their journey to New York. Families waited on the pier, some holding photographs of loved ones they hoped to find among the survivors, others clutching telegrams that had already delivered the worst possible news. The reunions were heartbreaking in their intensity. Wives falling into the arms of husbands they had feared were lost forever. Children crying out for parents who had been separated from them in the chaos of evacuation. Friends embracing with a desperation that spoke of their shared brush with mortality. But for every joyful reunion there were dozens of people who waited in vain, their hopes gradually fading as the last of the survivors disembarked and their loved ones failed to appear. Mrs. Earl Brown was among the last to leave the ship, her departure delayed by her insistence on helping other survivors navigate the chaos of their arrival. She had become something of a celebrity during the voyage, her forceful personality and determination to help others earning her widespread admiration. But as she stood on the pier, surrounded by reporters eager for her story, she seemed diminished somehow, the weight of what she had witnessed finally beginning to show. "Mrs. Brown," called out a reporter from the New York Times, his notebook already filled with quotes and observations. "Can you tell us about the final moments of the Titanic? What was it like when she went down?" Margaret Brown looked at the young man for a long moment, her eyes reflecting the terrible knowledge that she carried within her. "It was like watching the end of the world," she said finally, her voice carrying across the crowded pier with surprising clarity. "The greatest ship ever built, broken in half and sliding beneath the waves like she was made of paper. And the sounds of 1,500 people dying in the water. That's something you never forget, young man. That's something that stays with you forever." As the survivors dispersed into the city, beginning the long process of rebuilding their lives, Captain Rostron remained aboard the Carpathia, overseeing the final details of their arrival and preparing for the investigation that would surely follow. His ship had been transformed by the events of the past few days, No longer just a modest passenger vessel, but a symbol of human compassion and heroism that would be remembered long after her regular voyages had been forgotten. In the days that followed, the full story of the Titanic disaster would emerge in all its tragic complexity. There would be investigations and inquiries, lawsuits and recriminations, debates about safety regulations and the hubris of those who had declared the ship unsinkable. The disaster would lead to sweeping changes in maritime law, new requirements for lifeboats and radio equipment, protocols for distress calls and rescue operations that would save countless lives in the years to come. But at the heart of it all would remain the story of the Carpathia and her captain, the modest ship that had answered the call when it came, and the man who had risked everything to save strangers in distress. Their actions on that terrible night had proven that heroism was not the province of the great and famous, but the birthright of anyone willing to put the needs of others before their own safety and comfort. As the sun set over New York Harbor, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Captain Arthur Rostron stood alone on the bridge of his ship, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the Atlantic stretched endlessly toward the place where the Titanic lay broken on the ocean floor. The sea had given up some of its secrets that night, revealing both the worst and the best of human nature in the space of a few terrible hours. The Carpathia would sail again, carrying passengers and cargo across the same waters where she had performed her greatest service. But she would never again be just another ship, and her captain would never again be just another mariner. They had been tested in the crucible of disaster, and had emerged as symbols of hope and heroism, proof that in humanity's darkest hours, there were still those willing to risk everything for the sake of others. The night of April 14, 1912, would be remembered as one of the greatest tragedies in maritime history, but it would also be remembered as the night when an ordinary captain, and his modest ship, proved that the human spirit could triumph over even the most overwhelming adversity. In the cold waters of the North Atlantic, where 1,500 souls had perished, 705 had been saved by the courage of a man who had answered when duty called, and that made all the difference. In the years that would follow, the story would be told and retold, each generation finding in it new meaning and inspiration. Children would learn of Captain Rostron's heroism in their history books, sailors would speak of the Carpathia's desperate race through the icefield in hushed tones of respect, and survivors would carry the memory of that night with them for the rest of their lives, a reminder of both the fragility and the resilience of the human spirit. The Titanic had been lost, her passengers and crew claimed by the sea, in one of history's greatest disasters. But from that tragedy had emerged something else, a story of heroism and sacrifice that would inspire people for generations to come, a testament to the truth that even in the darkest hours, there were still those willing to risk everything for the sake of others. The modest cargo ship had become something legendary. In the space of a single night, her captain transformed from an ordinary merchant mariner into a hero whose name would be remembered long after the details of his regular voyages had been forgotten. And in that remembrance lay the true victory over the tragedy of the Titanic. Not in the lives that had been lost, but in the lives that had been saved, and in the example of courage and compassion that would continue to inspire humanity long after the last survivor had passed away, and the sea had claimed all memory of that terrible night. The Carpathia had answered the call, and in doing so, had proven that heroism was not dead, that human decency could still triumph over adversity, and that sometimes, the good guys really did win.